So let me ask you a question. What is the opposite of faith? Many people would say that, well, doubt is the opposite of faith. But I think this is wrong. I think this is misguided. I think the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. Within faith, there is always going to be an element of doubt. Within faith, there are always going to be questions that are going to need to be answered. There are going to be mysteries involved in faith. So let me ask you a question. What is the opposite of faith? A lot of people would say, well, the opposite of faith is doubt, right? But I would say that this is misguided. I would say that this is wrong. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. That's the opposite of faith. Within faith, there is always going to be an element of doubt. Within faith, there are always going to be questions that are unanswered, mysteries that are unsolved. And I think this is the definition of faith, frankly, that we find in Scripture. In some way, some would be quick to point out, well, doesn't Hebrews chapter 11, that classic definition of faith, doesn't it say that faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see? I mean, it's right there in the text that faith is certainty. I think that this is off. This is a misunderstanding for at least two reasons. The first reason is I happen to disagree with that particular translation. I think it's the better way to translate Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 is that faith is the evidence of things hoped for, the substance of things unseen. But that translation issue aside, I would also point out that whatever our definition of certainty is, which, when most people think of certainty, they think of something that is known beyond any shadow of a doubt. That certainly isn't the definition of certainty that the author of Hebrews is working with. Because when you look at all these examples of faith that he gives in Hebrews chapter 11, clearly these heroes of faith didn't possess that level of absolute certainty. Just read the story of Abraham, read the story of Moses, read the story of Noah. There are all sorts of questions, there are all sorts of reservations, there are all sorts of uncertainties involved in all of their journeys of faith. So no, I don't think that that certainty is a prerequisite for faith. As a matter of fact, I think that such an understanding of faith is very troublesome and problematic for people. For at least, I think people that have this understanding of faith end up making one of two errors. One error that people make is they say something like, well, I'll believe in God once I am presented with sufficient evidence. This is the classic agnostic response to God. If God would just give me enough evidence, if God would just reveal himself to me and answer all of my questions, then and only then can I believe in God. Then and only then can I follow God. The problem with that is, let's say that you answer this skeptic's questions to a reasonable level of comfort. Well, inevitably, that skeptic will come up with 10 more questions to take those questions' place. The reality is, if you're waiting for absolute certainty before you can believe in God, you will never believe in God because you will never run out of questions and mysteries about God. The other type of, I guess I'll say, mistake that is made with this definition of faith is that it produces Christians who have faith that is as inflexible as a plate glass window. And I've seen it time and time again. A child will grow up in the church. They'll grow up under the shelter of faith. They'll be taught to believe certain things about God. But the faith that they're given is very inflexible. The faith that they're given is ultimately very fragile. And what happens inevitably is the first time that somebody throws a rock at that faith, the first time that somebody challenges that faith, the first time that somebody asks them a question that they're unprepared to answer about that faith, that certainty shatters. And when that certainty shatters, so does their faith. So I don't think, again, just to return back to the point, that the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. Let me give an illustration from marriage. When a young man falls in love with a young woman, and they decide to get married, that wedding day is an act of faith. But that faith is neither blind nor is it certain. Certainly, we're not blindly going into a wedding day. We're making that decision to get married based on certain justifiable reasons. We have compatibility with each other. We like each other. We've talked about our future together. We have a reasonable knowledge of what the other person, of who the other person is, and what they are going to be like as a spouse. So the faith involved in a wedding day is not a blind faith, but it's also not a certain faith. The reality is when you say I do on your wedding day to your spouse, you're never completely sure what you're saying I do to. Basically, when you say I do on your wedding day, you're entering into a life of trust and commitment, but you're also entering into a life of faith-seeking understanding. As you and your spouse will grow together and will seek out a common life together for the rest of your lives. So marriage is an exercise in faith-seeking understanding. And a life of discipleship is much the same way. When we make a decision to believe in God and to trust God and to follow Jesus with our lives, I don't believe that this is a blind faith. I don't think that that's what Scripture says. We, I think, do have justifiable reasons for choosing to believe in God and to follow Jesus. So it's not a blind faith, but it's also not what we would call an absolutely certain faith either. We never know everything that there is to know about God. We can never know everything that there is to know about God. And so when we say yes to God, when we say yes to Jesus, when we enter into the life of discipleship, we enter into a life of faith-seeking understanding. Much like the heroes of faith that we read about in the New Testament, in places, or in the Old Testament and the New Testament, in places like Hebrews chapter 11. It is a life of trust and a life of commitment as we enter into it with faith, and we constantly in our lives are seeking out a better understanding, a more intimate understanding of what it means to know and to be known by God.